Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where I am very excited, but also can't believe that we have not covered this topic before. We are talking all about managing GI issues as a runner, managing gut issues as a runner. This is something that, we're already almost halfway, my goodness, through season 2 of the podcast. And honestly, I can't believe that we have not covered this topic in detail yet. And the reason that I'm so surprised is because this is such a common problem for so many runners. And you might be listening to this episode because you have gut issues as a runner. Maybe this is the first episode of the podcast that you've ever listened to because you were searching for answers for your GI problems. But I just want you to know that you are in very good company if you are someone who struggles in this area, because research has shown that 80% of runners have had gut issues at one time or another. 80%. That's pretty much everybody. And runners seem to have more GI issues compared to other athletes in other sports. And it seems to be a combination of factors, like the movement of running, right? The jostling movement of running can be hard on the GI tract. I also think that running, especially endurance running, long distance running, is uniquely challenging for runners to consume adequate fluid and fuel during. And we're going to talk about that as we get into the episode, why the inability to properly keep ourselves fueled and hydrated can kind of come back around to bite us and actually be the cause of some of the GI problems that we can experience. So it's partially the movement of running, partially the difficulty around the logistics and the strategy of actually getting in the energy and the fluids that we need. That can all kind of come to fruition in that running is particularly hard on the gut. And like I said, 80% of runners have had issues, GI issues at one time or another. Now, what is included in that? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about GI issues as a runner? Well, it's everything from like the upper end all the way to the lower end. And pardon me for today if some of this conversation does get maybe a little bit graphic, but if you've been there, and I think we can just all kind of save the embarrassment and have a conversation about it. So this includes upper GI symptoms, which would be like our nausea, vomiting, even acid reflux. Isn't one that I hear about as commonly from runners of having issues with acid reflux. But certainly, and as we'll talk about, certainly can happen if we have delayed gastric emptying, if the stomach isn't emptying out quickly enough. So nausea, vomiting, acid reflux, cramps, of course, bloating, gas, diarrhea. Constipation would also fall under this category, but this, for most people is more of an issue outside of running versus like during running. So the problem might not be that you're constipated during a run, because we all kind of want to be constipated during a run, but it might more be a problem that you're typically constipated and then you start running and then you're very, very unconstipated once you start running. So all of these different things. Now, some of these could be fairly minor, right? Some of these could be things that are not hugely detrimental to your performance. You're still able to run, still able to keep up, despite having maybe some minor issues in any of these departments. But more often than not, and I would say for most people, if you are experiencing cramping, if you're experiencing nausea, vomiting, if you're experiencing diarrhea, like all of these things are definitely going to derail your performance and actually might completely sideline your entire race day experience. So if these are things that are struggles for you, not only can it negatively impact your training and impact your running, but on the day of the race, you might wind up having a very, very challenging race day. So GI issues are something that are not expected. They're super common, but they're not something that you should just have to like live with or just deal with. There are a lot of solutions out there, and fortunately the solutions are not just about running fasted or just like not eating before a run, avoiding all foods and fluids and taking nothing with you. Because while that seems like a great solution, maybe in the short term or for shorter distances, shorter runs, there is absolutely no doubt that as you get to longer workouts, longer long runs, more intense workouts, as you build on your running volume, there's going to reach a point where not hydrating or not fueling is going to detract and negatively impact your performance. It doesn't feel like it at the time though, because if the difference is like, okay, well, if I eat or drink, I'm nauseous and have diarrhea. If I don't eat or drink, I can run. So it doesn't seem like at the time, like, it feels like fueling and hydrating is actually worsening your performance versus improving it. Because for a lot of people who are struggling with this stuff, it is the only way that you can get through a workout. And I totally understand that. But the good news is that with a little strategy, with a little practice, with a little gut training, we can actually start to fuel and start to be able to tolerate fluid and fuel during runs, during workouts, during races. And then it's amazing what can happen in a positive way to our performance when we're doing things properly. But if, our goal for taking in carbohydrates during a marathon is we want to be getting at least 60 grams of carbs per hour in during a race. So let's say you as a runner need to be consuming 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour and, 3/4 of a liter of fluid an hour. If you currently train with nothing and you currently do not eat before and you don't eat during and you don't hydrate during your runs because you have gut issues, if we just try to put in 60 grams of carbs an hour and, 3/4 of a liter of fluids, which I think would be maybe like 20, 26 ounces, perhaps somewhere in that ballpark, 24, 26 ounces of fluid per hour. I mean, you're going to feel awful. You're going to feel tremendously awful. You probably wouldn't even be able to get that much in. Like you probably wouldn't even be able to consume it. You would just feel so horrendous. It probably would come right back out, or maybe it's going to be making an appearance out the other end. I don't know. It's going to be bad. So we are looking at training the gut, slowly implementing these things, building up that tolerance, building up that ability so that you're not going from 0 to 60. You're going from 0 to 5 to 10 to 15 over the course of weeks, months, etc. So don't take this as like, okay, fueling and hydrating just like doesn't work for me because I tried to get to this number that you see out there all the time, had a horrible experience, this isn't for me. Or, on the day of the race, I tried a gel and I had a horrible run. So like, all this stuff doesn't work. It can and it does. It just sometimes takes a little bit longer and a little bit more practice and gut training than what I think is ever sort of talked about or ever sort of spoken about. So if you are listening to this as a runner who has gut issues and that is preventing you from fueling and you aren't sure if your performance is being impacted, it probably is. It's just the trade-off might not seem like it at the time. So hopefully today I'm going to give you some really good insight on what the problem is, what is going on with our bodies, with our digestive system, with the food, the fuel putting in, the gut-brain axis, all of those things. What is happening here? And then most importantly, what do we do about it? What are the steps that we can take to start improving our gut health as runners? So the first thing that I will say is that, there is no one size fits all approach. And as you're going to hear, as I'm talking about all the different reasons why something can be happening, it is going to be a little bit personal to you. So if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking, okay, I know I'm having this problem, but I don't know why. Like I'm listening to all these different options. I'm listening to different things that could be causing this. I'm not super clear on what my issue is. That's okay because we don't know until we start to do a little bit of digging. Sometimes it takes a little bit of detective work, takes a little bit of time to figure out What do we need to change? What do we need to do to manage the problem? So if you're struggling, just know that I am happy to be here to help you, either with one-on-one nutrition coaching to, start looking at this with you, getting tons of one-on-one appointments and accountability, and, having me hold your hand through the process of figuring this out. Or, of course, with my online group program, that's the Fuel Train Recover Club. This is something that we certainly cover regularly in our conversations with our live group calls, something that we have modules in the program built around are how to go through the steps of figuring out what's going on with your gut. So there are more resources, supports, things here to help you. I don't want you to walk away from this episode feeling even maybe more confused or more overwhelmed and going back to just not fueling and not hydrating, because that seems like the easier option than kind of opening up this can of worms. So what is causing the problem? So let's say we're having GI issues during a run. That could be anything, like I mentioned. That could be nausea, vomiting, could be acid reflux, could be diarrhea, cramps, bloating, you name it. What is causing the problem? So number one, the first thing that could be happening here is that something we are ingesting before or during the run is causing the problem. So we are taking something in beforehand, whether it's our pre-workout meal, maybe it's even something we're consuming the night before the run. That's definitely an option as well. Going a little bit further back, it might be our dinner before that we want to take a look at, but it could be something that we're consuming pre-run or during our run that is triggering the symptoms. So it could be that we are consuming a gel or a sport product or a sport drink that is too high in a sugar like fructose, or maybe lactose. Or perhaps it is too concentrated of a sugar, like we're taking a gel, but we're not taking that gel with enough water. So a gel typically is meant to be taken with between 4 and 6 ounces of water, which is going to be about half a cup of water. So like a few pretty good sips. You might even want to take like a half a gel at a time, but it's meant to be diluted a little bit in the stomach, so that we are not having a very, very concentrated source of sugar in the stomach all at once, because that can trigger the stomach to then slow down the emptying of the stomach, slow down gastric emptying. It also could be that we are consuming too much fat, too much protein, or too much fiber before or during a run. And again, this would just depend on the specific fueling choices that we're making. And I think with the popularity of low carb diets, having pre-workout meals that are higher in fat, higher in protein might be a little bit more common. And I'm thinking like someone maybe eating like almonds, eggs, or something like that before a run, where the fat, protein, and fiber all again are very slow to digest and break down. Now, outside of running, that's a good thing because those foods keep us full for longer after we have a meal. So we want our meals throughout the day to have enough fat, protein, and fiber in them, because that slows down gastric emptying. They are, take time to be digested and broken down and absorbed, which helps us to stay full and satisfied after we eat a meal. Really important. We can't just live on gels or live on energy chews, because we would be starving all the time. We would never get full. Might have a stomach ache, but we would never really be full. So those things, because they slow down the emptying of the digestive system, then when we run, those can be sitting in the gut and those can cause us to have some issues. Now, the other side of it could be that we're taking in maybe the right fuel, and when we're taking in the fuel that we should be, but that fuel isn't being digested quickly enough. So that leaves the fuel or the food sitting in the gut for too long, which ultimately can start to pull water into the GI tract. So typically what happens is in the small intestine is where all of the nutrient, a lot of the breakdown and digestion and absorption of nutrients happens. So the carbohydrates, the fuel that we take in during a run, those carbohydrates are being absorbed and entering the body from the gut in the small intestine. And then once we get to the large intestine, we should have fluid leaving the digestive system. So a lot of water absorption takes place in the large intestine, meaning that water is leaving the gut and it's going, being pulled back into the body. This is really important. If not, we would have very loose stools. We would have very watery bowel movements, which is something that can, happen when we have something like diarrhea, but we don't want that to be happening, right? That's not ideal, especially when we're running. So what can happen is that the fuel or the food that we're taking in isn't being digested quickly enough. So it's moving through the gut, not being absorbed, and then it's pulling this water in. Now, reduced blood flow to the gut in and around the digestive system can be negatively impacting the digestion of our fuel. So, what's happening, and this can be from a lack of gut training, right? We're not used to consuming fluid or fuel during a run. And so, this lack of training of the gut means that the blood flow, when we start to exercise, blood flow is redirected away from our digestive system out to our working muscles. Therefore, we are getting that lack of digestion and absorption. Dehydration is also a big one. And I think a lot of people don't think about this. A lot of people are not realizing not only does dehydration impact your performance, but dehydration is also going to impact your ability to fuel. And then sometimes also dehydration is going to impact your ability to hydrate. So imagine this. When you're at rest, when you're just sitting around, maybe you're listening to this podcast while you're like in the car, or when you're at work or whatever, you're just chilling. You have lots of blood flow concentrated around the digestive system. Now, especially after a meal. So you've eaten a meal and the body is going to send more blood flow to the digestive tract because it's busy breaking down the food, getting the nutrients out of it, transporting those nutrients out to your other organs and all that kind of stuff. So that blood flow is kind of concentrated around the gut. And this is what's going to, really optimize the speed of digestion, the quality of digestion, all of that stuff. When you start to exercise, when you go for a run, that blood flow is then redirected out to your working muscles. So we have less blood flow concentrated around the gut, more blood flow concentrated in our legs, right? In our arms, in our core, in our working muscles. So that means that we have less blood flow to be breaking down nutrients, to be doing the speedy work of digesting and absorbing food. And so that is going to cause us a lot of GI issues, or can potentially cause a lot of GI issues, especially with slow to break down nutrients, whether that's really concentrated sugar sources, fat, protein, fiber, etc. Now, the same thing can happen to a different degree, or to the same degree but for a different reason, if we are dehydrated. When we're dehydrated, our whole body blood volume is decreased. So it's not just a matter of that blood flow being redirected to the working muscles, but it's actually a matter of that blood flow. We don't have the blood in our working muscles where we need it, but then we also don't have enough blood flow in and around the gut to be properly digesting and absorbing our food. So dehydration can be a huge factor. And if you find as a runner that typically at the beginning of the runs, you're really good, but then as the run goes on, you start having more gut issues, like as you go, then that would be something that I would really be taking a look at is, are you adequately keeping yourself hydrated? And then, as I mentioned before, the concentrated sugar in the gut, so like a gel without adequate water, or this dehydration, tells the stomach to slow down GI emptying. So we take a whole bunch of sugar, we put it in the stomach, and that tells the small intestine, or tells the stomach, to slow down emptying, to pace out how that sugar is going into the small intestine. And then that sugar is going to be sitting in the stomach. And that, of course, can be problematic for a lot of runners as well. So just to recap what we've talked about so far, what could be causing the problem? Number one is that something we're ingesting is causing the problem. So something we're consuming before or during a run is the issue. The second thing can be that the fuel that we're taking in isn't being digested quickly enough. So for some reason, we have slowing down of the food leaving the stomach and the food being digested and absorbed. The third thing can be that we have an increase in something called gut transit time. So the third thing is that we can have an increase in how quickly things are moving through the digestive system. A lot of this can be caused by stress or anxiety, especially if you're stressing about having gut issues. Unfortunately, that really increases the chances that you're going to have gut issues. So part of this whole process is also just learning how to try and minimize anxiety, minimize stress around the gut problems. And then the other thing that can really have an impact here is caffeine. So consuming too much caffeine either before training or during training, caffeinated gels, caffeinated chews, all the various caffeine containing products. Caffeine can absolutely be a performance enhancer and is for a lot of people. However, we also need to keep in mind that there is going to be a trade-off point where caffeine might increase stress and anxiety, and caffeine might increase the frequency of gut issues, specifically things like an increased frequency of bowel movements. So that could be diarrhea. It could also come along with having cramps, bloating, etc. So a lot of these reasons are very interconnected. A lot of the reasons that we could be having gut issues can be that, we're consuming something that is causing a problem. That means that digestion is slowing down, which means that we can't take in the hydration that we need to and get the fluids we need to stay hydrated, which means that we're going to have more problems. So there's lots of things that can be going on here. This also might mean that we're going to have an increase in stress or anxiety about having problems. So then every time we go out for a run and we're worried about having a problem, we're going to have a problem. So it can become a very vicious cycle, and it can feel like, how do we break this chain? How do we get out of this? Because the answer feels like, well, we just don't eat. We just don't hydrate. We just and hope for the best, get out on that long run to say 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 miles. And then we're just completely conking out. We, line up at the start line of the race, and we know that by the time we get to mile 10, we are going to be just completely out of gas. We're just hoping and praying and, trying to get through. One of the major things that I end up doing with the athletes that I work with is really focusing on hydration, staying hydrated as much as possible, reducing dehydration and the effects of dehydration. And the reason is because when we get dehydrated and then we have less blood flow to the gut, it's very hard to start playing catch up without having to stop exercising, like without having to stop running. And this is because we still are demanding that blood flow be out in our working muscles. We're still demanding that blood flow be out doing its job in the body, but then we're taking in fluid and it's just not going anywhere. So that often is when we have to stop. Sometimes people end up having to vomit. And then, we are having to slowly start that rehydration process, adding in electrolytes, to speed up the absorption of the fluids until we can get back on the right track. This, of course, is going to slow you down tremendously, slow you down, out to a very high degree. So if we can stay on top of our hydration, it makes the fueling so much easier, so much smoother. So it all kind of starts there. How do we do it? Because if you're currently someone who can't drink water, can't do anything, you have to be so careful before you go for a run because you feel terrible no matter what you do. Number one, the first thing that I want you to be thinking about is gut training. So I want you to be hydrated, staying hydrated all the time. So just thinking about hydration just throughout the day, making sure you're taking in enough fluid so that you're not starting every workout already at a disadvantage hydration wise. But the second thing we want to do is we want to really focus on training the gut, because when we start looking at what is the best intra-run fuel, what's the best thing to have before a workout, how much carbohydrate can and should we take in during a run or during a race, it really comes down to practice and training the gut to tolerate whatever fuel, whatever type of product, whatever foods we're going to use. When they look at research, and they've of course been doing a lot of research over the years on this, but trying to figure out what is the best, optimal amount of carbohydrate, for example, to take in per hour during a run or during a race. And what we see is that, we can go quite high. Like athletes are now taking in, 90, 100 grams, 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Not necessarily just runners, but cyclists and stuff like that are taking in really, really high volumes. But we always see better outcomes, better performance when they've undergone gut training. If you take an athlete who is untrained, has no gut training, and try to give them, like I said before at the beginning of the show, 60 grams or 90 grams or something like that of carbohydrate per hour, they're not going to see an increase in performance, mostly because they're probably going to have gut issues. So it's not that we can't absorb or digest that. It's just that we need to train our gut in order to be able to do it. And what do we do here is we're just very, very slowly increasing our ability to tolerate food and fluid before a run. We're talking about starting with a few sips of water. We're talking about starting with a bite of food, not a whole gel, not by any means a whole gel. We're talking about one energy to chew. We're talking about a single graham cracker, just very, very small amounts of things to increase, especially if you have quite severe gut issues. This is something that's like a very significant problem for you. Then, you're going to have to go even slower and just build up over time. If you're someone who, already has pretty good tolerance, you just want to be able to tolerate more, then, a little bit more of an accelerated timeline is probably appropriate. But it's always, again, important. Just listen to your body and be consistent. Like I said before, staying hydrated is so, so key. I think that a lot of issues come from dehydration and, just not getting in the fluids that we need to make everything else fall into place. We also want to look at that pre-run meal, limiting fat, protein, and fiber if needed pre-run. Some people don't have an issue with fiber or a little bit of protein and fat, like a couple grams, say having like peanut butter on a toast would be fine, whereas other runners have to be more mindful and maybe just stick with something like jam. Some people might do fine with higher fiber intra-run fuel, like they could be eating dates or other dried fruits on a run. For some runners, that's just not going to work, and they need to be really careful about limiting fiber. It is all about finding out what works for you and what you feel best doing. So it comes down to practice, comes down to consistency, and it comes down to incorporating these strategies of gut training and being consistent with intra-run fueling well before you're in race day crunch time. So ideally, you want to give yourself a minimum of 12 weeks to do your gut training. I think a lot of runners could benefit from gut training for even longer, especially if you're someone who isn't doing a tremendously high volume of running. If you imagine, a half marathon training program or something, even a full marathon training plan, you might only have a handful, maybe 8 significantly long runs to do over the course of that training plan. In my opinion, that may not be enough time to really tease out figuring out what works best for you. Like, what do you like in terms of the fueling? And then second to that, what, actually putting the time into training the gut. So if we want to think about how do we make sure that we're ready for a really good race day experience, how do we make sure that we've figured out the plan and also trained ourselves to be able to tolerate the amount of fuel that we need and the hydration that we need, it might start for you well before that 12-week mark. And that's okay if it does, right? This is an ongoing process, something we're going to do for the rest of our running career. We're not just going to take in food and fluid before a run just for a few weeks here and a few weeks there and then leave it out the rest of the time. It all depends on our training volume. The other thing that I will say is once we've trained our gut, once we've figured out the process, figured out the foods and fluids that we're going to include on race day, we've nailed down our pre-run breakfast and all that kind of stuff. In the actual long runner race scenario, we want to be fueling often and fueling early. So taking in those small amounts frequently throughout the run. Don't wait until it's been an hour or an hour and a half of running and you're starting to feel poorly, starting to notice your performance declining or starting to get some GI issues coming on before you take action and before you start to fuel and hydrate. Taking in the fuel and taking in the fluids frequently and early before you think you need them is going to help prevent a lot of these gut issues, which is so, so important. And then the final thing is that, we want to be careful about caffeine. We want to potentially limit caffeine before we run. We want to maybe limit the caffeinated products that we're using, especially if we're trying to aim for, the 60 plus grams of carbs per hour. We're looking at taking in, 3 or more gels per hour of running. And so in this case, that may be something that if we're using, say, all caffeinated gels, that could be a tremendous amount of caffeine that we're taking in. So something to look at, something to consider is that we want to be looking at how much caffeine are we consuming and is that maybe contributing to some of our issues. So looking at what are we consuming before and during our runs? Is there something there we need to modify? Is there something with our hydration that we need to modify? do we just need to train the gut? Do we just need to go slow and consistently increase the food and fluid that we're taking in, and just build up over time, give ourselves more time to be able to digest and absorb considerable amounts of fluid and fuel during a run? Are we just waiting too long to take anything in? Do we need to start fueling and hydrating more often and earlier in a run or in a race? And do we need to look at our caffeine consumption? So that's how we can manage GI issues as a runner. There's a lot to consider, a lot of moving parts here, but I promise you it does not need to be as complicated or as difficult as what it might sound like at sort of first pass or when you first hear about this. I know that for a lot of people, it just feels easier or seems easier to just not deal with this. And like I said, just not fuel, not hydrate, anything like that. But if you're really looking to level up your performance, or if you're looking to take on new distances that you haven't done before, you are going to have a much, much, much easier time if you have a fueling plan in place and if you're adequately hydrating yourself during those workouts. So I hope that you found this episode helpful. I hope that you got some good advice, some good understanding, some good knowledge around what is happening in the GI system. Why are you experiencing some of the things you're experiencing? But I also want you to know that if you are struggling and feeling confused or overwhelmed or anything like that, I am here to help, and I would love to help you figure out your gut issues so that you can train consistently, train strong, have a great race day experience, and you know what, maybe even a couple PRs down the road. So thanks again for tuning in. I so appreciate you spending your time with me today, and we will see you back here for next week's episode. If you want more information about working with me, about my online programs, how you can work with me one-on-one or in that online capacity, please feel free to visit my website. You can get all of the details at www.stephanienatchek.com. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.